Let me just check that it's on. Yeah, it seems to be airing. So welcome everyone to SQL Friday number 149. We have today Jared. I should have asked before how to pronounce your last name. I'm gonna guess it's gonna be Jared Kuehn, or
So the short answer on that is yes, you are correct. That it is a German last name, so Kuhn is correct. However, uh, brief family history here, we changed the pronunciation to Keen. My grandparents came over to the U.S. right after World War II, and the short answer is here in the U.S., people were not looking kindly on Germans at that moment in history, and so they changed the pronunciation.
I get it.
But I accept both. I'm not particular.
That's cool. So Jared, anyway, Jared's going to talk about how we can establish T-SQL coding standards, and I very much look forward to it. So welcome to SQL Friday, Jared.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll say I'm still getting used to the whole idea of getting up either in the morning or late in the evening, and suddenly I'm talking to people who are hundreds of miles away from where I am. But honestly, it's been cool, and I'm thankful for the opportunity for that. So thanks, Magnus, for inviting me.
Yeah, it
I guess
wouldn't be
I'll
much of a show without the speakers, so it's I who should be thankful.
Well, I'll say if anything, like the reason for me doing this is I've learned so much from communities like this, people getting up in front of a group of people and sharing information about the things that they've done, the things that they've learned, and
Hmm.
I'm just trying to pass the torch there and continuing that sort of tradition.
Yeah, and I mean for me, I feel very much the same, and also I would not be where I am career-wise without the SQL community. So, and to starting to engage as a speaker a bit over 10 years ago, it's really helped me. I wouldn't have started my own business without being a part of the community, I think.
Good on you for that. Like having both balanced is, in my mind, incredibly important. That's what the things I'm striving for in my work too is I'm going to be a technician, but I'm also going to support the community, and I'm not going to let one get in the way of the other
Hmm.
because they work together, really.
Yeah. So whenever you're ready, you can take over or start screen sharing. And just one question, if there are questions, do you want me to interrupt you or will you stop for questions during the talk?
Sure thing. So, I typically do stops here and there mainly because I need a water break. So I will certainly do stops during the presentation to ask for questions, but as people have them, please feel to ask them and interrupt me at any point. I am happy to answer questions at any time.
Cool. The stage is yours, Jared.
Alrighty. All right. Well, once again, at least to the Sequel Friday group, welcome. Happy to be here. And today, talking about a sequel community, I thought it'd be good to talk about SQL. So we're going to talk about SQL, but from the lens of formatting or what we think of as coding standards. So first of all, in case you're not too familiar with me, which given the geographical distance here, you might not be. My name is Jared Kuhn. I am a senior data engineer for a consulting practice here in the United States. But really, the important thing you need to know about me is I'm really two facets of an individual. The first side is I'm a technical guy. So I've been working in the consulting industry for well over 10 years now. I've been consulting in Microsoft data products for that time. I've got certifications because consulting, we're expected to have certifications for all of those fun consulting reasons. And I love solving logic puzzles. That's a lot of why I like doing the technical work. But I'm not just a technician. I'm also a storyteller. I have theater as a degree here in the United States. I love telling stories, and that's because not only do I think they're enjoyable and they're fun, but they're also great for education. If you go back to the dawn of time, We did not start sharing information with one another by presenting each other with Excel reports. We shared information with one another by telling stories, and that stories would not only help us engage as a community, but would help us learn from each other to understand one another. And so that's my goal, is to share stories that are both educational, fun, and has a little bit of professionalism in there, as you can see from my picture, which is AI generated. Oh crap, that's a wrong one. Here, let me fix that. All right, slides, I need my new picture. No, not that one. That's my goofy picture. We're not supposed to show that one. Get to the next one. Okay, well, I mean, this one at least has helps me look a little bit more adventurous. That's not any better. Get my actual photo. There we go. Okay, that's what I actually look like without glasses. Okay, in case you needed that visual. All right. So maybe I'm a little more goofy than I let on, but that's because, again, let's at least make this fun, because people who have fun with things tend to want to engage more. So let's at least have some fun with this today. Today's performance, or today's story, is going to be about formatting standards. And we're going to look at it from the lens of T-SQL because it's in a very interesting light, knowing how widely it can be used as a language in comparison to other programming languages. But if you're looking at this and following along today, I'm going to assume there's a possibility you're in a situation where you're not adopting any sort of formatting or coding standards today. Under that assumption, we're going to talk about why or how are we here in the first place, because if we don't know that, then there's not a whole lot of reason to talk about the next steps on that. Once we get past that, we're going to talk about what it means to establish a standard. And there's more facets to it that I think needs consideration than one might think. And I'll explain that a little bit more later on. And then finally, the big catch statement that should get everybody interested, and I'm serious, it's not just a buzzword on this. AI assistance. What does that have to do with coding standards? And I'll give you a hint, it's not just hype. I think there's actually some really good practical applications for it, and we'll try and do some demonstrations of that at the end of the presentation. As Magnus mentioned, any point that you have questions, comments, concerns, either pertaining to the topic or pertaining to the fact of why I'm wearing hats. Short answer is I'm a hat collector and I love hats, and this is like my favorite hat in the world. Um, Feel free to ask them at any point in time. I'd be happy to answer them as they pertain to today's topic. With that, let's start our story. So our story starts here, and it starts at a place that we've been before. It's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. You're ready to finish your work day. You're ready to finish your work week, and you've left yourself some menial tasks to get finished. You got all your hard work done, and you're ready to just cruise into the weekend so you can enjoy your weekend, relax, and get charged up for that next week. And then you get that email. You get that email from somebody that says, "Oh crap, I need to get these numbers ready for Monday, and I'm struggling with these queries. I can't figure out what's going on. Can you help me?" And, like a good coworker, you're sitting there and saying, "Sure, of course I'll help you." I mean, the stuff I have to do isn't necessary. I'm feeling good about helping a coworker on a Friday. That'll easily help me into the weekend as well. And that's when I have to shift into my low voice, because that was the wrong choice to make, because little did he know that he was going to lose the next couple of hours to this really unfortunate circumstance as he opens the first email and he's introduced to this horrible monstrosity of a query. What is this? Like, seriously, what is this? There's parentheses everywhere. So there might be subselects. This might be a CTE string. I have no idea how to read this. What am I going to do with it? Okay, maybe we don't have to worry about this one. Let's check the second one. The second one's got to be better, right? And that's when he should have just stopped there, because the second query isn't going to be any better. And so he opens the second query and he's introduced to this. Ah! A set of CTEs, and none of them are formatted consistently. And they even differ in join principles. Who does that? Oh my gosh, like why? Why? Okay, okay, all right, all right. I'm not touching this one first. The third one has got to be better than this, right? But it wasn't better than that because he opened up the third query and it got even worse. Okay, maybe this one's an exaggeration. Nobody formats their queries in the letters D and B for any sort of logical reason, but you get my point. Okay? If you've worked in the industry long enough with data, presumably you've written SQL and presumably you've seen queries like this from somebody either that somebody sent it to you or sometimes in a pinch when you're working on things for hours on end and you're focused on solving a problem, not necessarily formatting, you end up with queries like this. And here's my question for you to consider for our topic today. How long does it take? All right. How long does it take to read this? Not just in terms of being able to read the code itself, but to genuinely understand what is this code doing? What problem is it solving? Why is it written the way that it is? When you think about it that way, you have to question, all right, it's just formatting, right? Formatting's not a big deal, right? Well, I would ask you to consider it's a bigger deal than people would want to let on. I'll show you a quick study here from the International Data Corporation. This was done about 2 years ago, and I'm not going to take time to talk about the full study of it, but there's one particular statistic shown here that I think tells a very interesting story relevant to today's topic. It's this particular statistic here. The knowledge worker spends about 2.5 hours per day, or roughly 30% of the workday, searching for information. And think about that definition of information. Like, okay, information probably means we're talking about things in terms of documentation. We're talking about, perusing SharePoint maybe to get information or our file shares, might be looking through our emails for the hundreds to hopefully not thousands of emails that we get on a daily basis to get the information we need to do our job. But thinking about that information, that includes code. That includes being able to understand the code that we work with day in and day out. So when we think about that, 2.5 hours per day that we spend not looking at code, and especially in situations where we may be looking to collaborate with one another, that could be a significant concern because that can easily lead to a lot of possible bad effects. Things like innate tech debt. If I'm spending so much time trying to just read certain code bases, what's the chance that I'm going to miss something that ultimately is going to run into significant issues down the road? All right, I'm not going to necessarily have the best amount of time to think about what could happen with this code in the future. Leads to some innate tech debt there. A lack of collaboration. If your code is not pretty and it takes me 3 to 4 hours to get to a point where I just genuinely understand what you're doing here, that's a struggle in terms of collaboration. If your code's not pretty, am I going to want to collaborate easily? Probably not. And that leads to time-intensive bug fixes. Hours of code just to read something on that Friday afternoon to try and understand what could just be a change that takes 15 minutes. That's a lot of time lost for little gain. And so then you risk things as far as longevity for your code. Your knowledge base walks out the door. I mean, for those active on the call right now, if you use the raising hands feature on Teams, I mean, has anybody in this situation? I know I've been there. Somebody leaves an organization for retirement or walking out the door. Now you're managing their code base. You haven't had a chance to look at it yet, and you look at it, and you're stuck in those circumstances we just showed earlier. I know I've been there. And I know a number of people who have been there as well. And I'm seeing hands raised here too. So you've been there too. All right. When that knowledge base walks out for an organization, that's scary. And if organizations at large scale knew that these types of situations came up, in their shoes, I would be concerned as well. And that could easily lead to lack of trust in output, which is especially critical for something like SQL that could not just be supporting technical solutions like ETL or data processing, could be supporting your reports too. That's so close to your business user interactions. That's a huge deal. So let's take a step back. How do we get here? Why do we get here? You can summarize it, I think, in a couple of ways. Some people at least will make the argument, and you know, there's certainly some aspects of this that are right. There are things, some aspects of that that are a little bit misguided. People who say that code is intuitive, so things like comments, things like um things like your code, the way that it's written, it's just innately intuitive, right? I mean, it's code. It's meant to be logical, so following the logic is just easy to do. Well, yes, it is, but usually there's one thing that's consistently an issue there. Regardless of how code's formatted, regardless about how well it is or is not commented, a lot of times there's one key factor that's left out of things. Code will tell you how it works. Code will not tell you why the writer chose to write it the way that they did. And unless the code itself innately tells them that, or the comments do, that's something that's consistently lost. Case in point, I've had at least my worst case in a situation like this was somebody walked out of the organization. I adopted their code base, and I was brand new to the organization. So not only that, but I had no chance to look at their code. To fully understand some of the things that they wrote, 2 to 3 months of just reading code to try and understand what happened. And it was a lot of it because formatting. It wasn't necessarily that the logical code itself was there. The formatting wasn't there, so it took that time. And because they walked out the door, I could no longer ask them understanding why, and they didn't document it anywhere. I think another big reason why we get into these sorts of situations is priority. I think of it in terms of the triangle of priorities that consistently comes up is um, the time, budget, quality of product. You're in that situation long enough, and typically of those three, you're having to pick one to prioritize. For a lot of organizations that I work with, quality of product typically is not the one that is prioritized. It's usually either budget or it's time, which translates into budget. And so in a situation like that, think about it something like a coding standard, easily formatted code. That's a quality of product principle, unless we advocate for it more strongly than that. So there, it's something that is easy to not prioritize. And then I think for a lot of organizations, this is how they get by with how we allow ourselves to move along without having strong coding standards is impact analysis. We're data people, right? We want to use data to make decisions. Have you done analysis in your organization to assess whether your state of your code is either positively or negatively impacting the work that you do? That 2.5 hours a day that we talked about with that initial statistic. If you're not doing that sort of analysis, and I would like to think more organizations are doing this than I think are doing that out there today. If you don't know the impact of it, then of course it becomes secondary. If you don't look at a problem, we're not going to prioritize the problem. I think there is just a number of examples of things, and I'd be curious for people who are attending this to sound off on if you think this is something that you're running into, why do you think you're running into it? At least for me, these are some things that have held pretty tried and true for me in my experience. So think about it again. From the lens of somebody like a business user, wouldn't you be concerned if your entire code base looked like this? I say that for SQL especially because SQL, while it has become a language heavily used by technical experts, if you go back to the SQL language of what it was initially intended for and what it can be used for, it's intended for a wider audience than that. It's intended for citizen developers who are looking to analyze data directly. It's intended for data scientists who are looking to prep data for some targeted analysis or for maybe getting data ready for some machine learning or AI scenarios. There's such a wide audience of people that get involved with data and innately get involved with SQL one way or another. And if our entire code base looks like this, that can have a huge impact on the organization because it increases the number of people who could be impacted by the 2.5 hours a day. So we need a solution. We need a coding standard. All right? That's why we're here today. Any questions on that so far while I take a quick water break?
We do have like comments more than questions. Like one can easily reformat the queries via Copilot, which I myself wouldn't. Copilot is going to give me some formatting, and the next time it's going to give me another formatting. So that's not the choice for me, at least. And then there is a question: why not just rewrite from scratch at some point during these 2 months? And that is not sometimes a bad idea, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, Adrian, you're getting to the punchline. So we will talk about that as far as reformatting the queries. So we'll get to that in a little bit later on here. Um, well, what do you look like without the hat? Here you go. All right, just hair. I keep my hair incredibly long because, you know, I don't know. I don't like short hair for
I
whatever
remember
reason.
having hair. Those were the days.
I think that's more what I'm paranoid about. It's like I'm starting for this in case in the future that like, okay, I can do this, and now, okay, who knows? Maybe 2, 3 years down the road, could be bad.
Mm-hmm.
And why not just rewrite the code from scratch? I'll say honestly, in that situation, I would have considered it, but because of priorities of the organization, there was so much code I had to learn and understand to be able to adopt that code base. I didn't have the time to reformat it. For sure, this was at a time where when I adopted that code base, AI, generative AI, all those things was not a thing yet. So if I were to take the time to do that, I would have either had to like implement or purchase a product that helps setting, which you can get them out there, but sometimes the price point doesn't necessarily make sense for your organization, or otherwise other priorities take over. While I was adopting that code base and such, I was being asked to actively make changes to it, and it was on timelines that I didn't have the time to meet the deadline and also focus on reformatting. So I have to make that choice. Do I invest the time in it, or do I focus on the priorities of the organization? It's at least the thought did come to mind of, do I just focus on reformatting this? And with more time, I would have tried focusing on it. I reformatted it where I could, but I couldn't do it everywhere. Some of that code is still in a very unpretty state. So we'll get into the topic of like some of the seeing those questions from Alexander about like reshape or Redgate. I'll show you at least where, and I'll say that at least for some organizations this won't be a popular thing. I would not spend the money on things like the Redgates or the resharpers because there are cheaper ways to do it with AI and to do it in a reliable way. So I would not at least, so you could use it in those cases, but I think there are cheaper alternatives out there with AI there today. 2 months seems ridiculous for almost any app or platform, both learning and building from scratch. I don't know if I want to go too deep into detail about what the full extent of this, but I'll say it this way. Um, typically you'd expect in that type of situation, it was just one solution. Like it was well, the full solution itself was targeted around analytics. But when I say it was one solution, it was more like six analytical solutions that should have been one. So, And I'll say too, it was six different solutions, all trying to solve the same problem, written by the same individual over the span of about 15 years. And so rather than trying to fully replace the solution each time, he basically replaced part of the solution with a brand new solution. And then that one didn't work, so then he replaced that solution with a brand new solution, but he didn't deprecate the two previous solutions. So there, like, okay, obviously that's more of an exaggerated use case because it gets into kind of what closely is related to formatting and coding standards, which is code administration and product administration, which is what this is closely related to. So it's a complicated situation, but I'd say at least for my circumstances, yeah. In other situations, maybe you could have reformatted things, and I did where I could, but also I couldn't do it 100% everywhere, and because I didn't do it 100% everywhere, now look at the code base. Some of the code base is in my coding standard. Some of the code base is in whatever was in their mindset for coding standards, and we didn't have time to agree.
Mm.
Community is part of this. So one part is the technical aspect. The other part that we're going to start talking about here is the community side of it. So let's shift into that type of mentality. All right. So let's talk about that in terms of the coding standard itself. Now, with the time at least that we have today, we could go in different directions as far as like the actual coding standards. There are a lot of things out there in the community that advocate for certain types of approaches and things that you'd advocate for. But here's at least a couple things to think about if you're in a situation looking to adopt a coding standard. You're looking for consistent style. Obviously, formatting is what's key here in a lot of the tools and what things are people are trying to do today. They're trying to make their code easy to read. What makes it easy to read across the board? Consistent style. Not a surprise. You should be looking to adopt a standard that is functionally beneficial. If you're somebody who works in something like SQL Server Management Studio and you like using your hotkeys, Control K, Control C, Control K, Control U to comment and uncomment lines of code, make sure you're adopting a standard that actually supports that because it'll help you for writing and debugging your own code. It'll help you for interacting with others. But probably the biggest thing that I think I see organizations who don't have a standard that are struggling with it, they adopt a coding standard that's like 50 pages long. And the human brain typically, once you get past 6 or 7 unique items that you're trying to remember, how much do you remember it? Not a whole lot with a whole lot of extensive study. If you're looking to start a coding standard, here's my advice to you. Define a standard that is 6 properties or less because it'll stick in memory. And what have we learned from technology? Things that stay in memory are more performant. Not just a technology principle, it works for our brains as well. And probably the biggest thing, and I say this especially targeting T-SQL here, is that when we're talking about needing a coding standard, look to adopt the coding standard that is agreed upon by anybody writing code. And I mean anybody. So I talked earlier about how the target audiences of people who are using SQL. If you're the base development team for your organization, you're using SQL, you should be looking to adopt the standard, obviously. If you're an analyst writing data or writing queries for reports, you should be looking to adopt the standard as well. If you're that citizen developer working in some sector of the business and you're looking to get involved in writing queries, and you might be the one who emails your technical counterparts on that Friday afternoon, you should adopt the coding standard as well. It should be uniform across the board. Why? Because at that your code, it's a business asset. It's something that the business is going to rely on in one way or another. And because of that, you want everybody to be on the same page because you want everybody to be able to collaborate. So now we need to talk about how are you going to sell it? And at least I'm seeing your comments on all the rules. So let's I'll at least get to that point in a little bit here. So you bring up some really good points there. I'll get to that in a moment, but let's at least frame it up by thinking about what needs to go into adopting the coding standard in its entirety. So all the things I talked about is more the technical side of it. What do we need to adopt in terms of a standard, and how do we need to or how do we need to define what the standard is? That's only part of the discussion. The bigger part is to the point that Lalo Rules is bringing up. If you're in a situation like this and you're running into this, it's a bigger issue than just technical. This is gets to kind of process, it gets to culture, it touches all facets of an organization. And so more than likely that means you're going to have to get people convinced to adopt a standard. Because if you're running into situations like I described, or other people have run into because of what people are doing with Gen AI and why solutions like ReSharper and Redgate exist, you're going to need to get people on board with adopting this because more than likely you're not running into this now. So, what should you be doing? Well, you need to think of it in terms of a sales pitch. You're advocating for an improvement in quality of product, and that's sometimes the most difficult things to advocate for. So, I want to take a moment to say, how should we be advocating for this so that more people get into a better situation with their code? My advice here is don't be like my buddy here, Sven. So Sven is a really competent coder. He's really good with his code. He writes it nice and effectively, but I don't know if I necessarily trust him to be the one trying to get people to adopt a coding standard because he gets a little bit rough with it. So if you were to ask Sven, and like I asked him, how do you get people to adopt a coding standard? He goes into some really difficult spots like this. So he starts off like this. You better adopt my coding standard, or otherwise I'm going to be very frustrated with everybody. I'm not answering your emails anymore, and I'm walking out the door with all of my code uncoded. Okay, okay, Sven, that's a little bit harsh. All right, nobody's going to listen to that, and nobody likes people going in with a hard fist. You got to get people on board for something more than just saying it's going to make your work easier. All right, well, how about this? Look, I need your help. Those emails on Friday afternoons are impossible. Please make my life a little bit easier. Okay, okay. Sven, you're still just focusing on yourself. The point of coding standards and such is that we're talking about community here. We're trying to get people on the same page. So that's not going to work, okay? Try and line up the message a little bit. Can you line it up a little bit? Okay, pop culture references so it works. So, it's my code, and I'll code if I want to, code if I want to. Okay, Sven, that doesn't really work at all because one, I don't think that gets the point across. Now you're a little too soft, and I don't think you really understand that what we're going for here. So just, all right, just come straight short into the point. Okay, can you do that, Sven? Of course I can do the point. I've got horns. All right, straight to the point. Your code is ugly. Code is ugly and it's hard to read. Okay. All right. We're done with that. All right. Sven doesn't really get the message here. And obviously that's an exaggeration, but how many times has that come up? Somebody at least determines that the code base isn't working well and you need somebody starts advocating for it, and what does it turn into? A lone individual speaking out with a voice in a community that isn't convinced that this is needed. And if they're not convinced, well, gets lower on the priority list. They move on with their day. The result, bad things are going to happen. Dirty code, circumstances where, like, if people are not willing to adopt it for those types of situations and people are still in a situation where they're not looking to adopt a standard, if this is the way you're trying to convince them, they're likely not going to be convincing. Yes, to Lala rules, that probably speaks to much bigger issues of adopting a standard where your base coding teams and whatnot, maybe there are some bigger issues there. But even still, if there are those bigger issues there, an argument like this isn't going to convince them. So it is a bigger issue and it needs solving, but you're not going to get people on board that way. So how do we get them on board? We need to think of it as a sales pitch because we really are going to have to sell it to our organizations more widely to get this change to occur. So some of the things we should be talking about instead, long-term sustainability. The example I had there earlier was a good example. You've probably got your stories as well that lead to that. Being able to transition code from individual to individual, if you can't easily do that, that's a big risk in terms of sustainability. And it speaks to that team effectiveness. Coding standards, easily reading code across developers helps people talk to one another, helps people communicate. And nowadays, not a lot of us are writing code in a vacuum, at least not anymore. So focusing on team effectiveness is going to be incredibly important. That end user support, those citizen developers, those are the people who a lot of times, because of priorities, they're going to have time to learn how to write code. They may not always have the time to learn to write code for best performance considerations, for best approaches to processing data, for effectively using indexing, all those things that technical experts know. And when that citizen developer needs help, that technical expert may not always have a lot of time. That 2.5 hours, they don't always have that time to afford. So we really want to support them. So we want to make it so that our code makes it easier to find information. And that should be what business users and anybody in the organization should want to hear. They want their data to be easier to find. They want their information to be easier to find because how many technical projects are they asking you to launch to implement better processes, to implement improvements in applications? All that seeks the same thing. They're looking for easier ways to find information to do their jobs more effectively. You can get people on board there. I think everybody can agree. That should be a better selling point for many organizations, right? All right, demonstration. Let's take a moment for a water break and see what else people are talking about. Ooh, there's a very lively chat going on.
Yeah, big discussion about does this really happen? Blah blah blah. And to Lolo rules, I'm not gonna name my clients, and
I'd
there is no need to be rude.
yeah. Yeah, I like okay. So you have to keep in context here. And if you don't genuinely believe me on this, so give a little bit of context. So maybe at least if you're in an organization for an extended period of time, I could see the argument. Take a look at the world of consulting. All right. So perfect example is for me, so I work as a consultant. I've been doing that for well over 10 years now. And this is at least the situations that I'm in. I'm consistently in situations where I have to walk into organizations, and many organizations, at least for sure in the US, work under this premise of bringing in consultants, bringing in contractors for a specific specified period of time where they need to come in and they have to have some influence on your code base, implementing something, improvements, or just helping on as a development team. Um, I would say like think about that sort of situation. Some of it, yes, comes to hiring, but some of it is what does coding standards influence in terms of getting that person onboarded. So a metric that I would love to track more with organizations is how long does it take to get a contractor or consultant up and running on your code base? I'll tell you the difference that I've had in my experience. The environment that had the probably the strongest coding standards I've seen, I walked into that organization, I was up and running and building code for their code base 3 days. 3 days is all it took to be able to understand their code base and to start building code to be functional. Contrast that with the other situation where I'm not joking. It was for the priorities and such, and I was making at least some adjustments there, but it took a good at least 2 to 3 weeks before I could even get to the point where I felt like I could actively make adjustments to the code and not risk breaking something down the chain.
Mm.
That at least is just two examples, and those are probably the widest extremes of things. But you're talking the difference of at least 10 days there, theoretically, where in one situation I was able to be a contributing member there, and on something like a 3 month contract, the difference between 3 days to get up and running and 3 weeks to get up and running is significant. Maybe that hasn't been your experience, but I'll say at least for me, that genuinely has been in my experience, and I've run into that on multiple locations.
Mm.
And everybody has different situations. That's completely expected. We're all individuals. We're expecting to have different experiences, and that ultimately is what's reflected in our code, is our different experiences and what we bring into it. A coding standard helps us move in the direction of this code isn't just for me as an individual. This code is for me as a development team. It's for us as an organization. It's a business asset, the same as the PowerPoint slides that are shared on your quarterly info sharings. It's the same that you would share to your customers widely. It's just not as visible, so it doesn't always get the same love and affection. I've worked in many banks and I've never seen it. That's interesting to see. Like, I honestly have not worked in the banking industry a whole lot. I've worked in financials, and there at least sometimes the financials it's really good. But I'll tell you, I've worked in other organizations, retail. I've run into issues with this, but there again, the sometimes there the budget there isn't as necessarily strong. Nonprofits, um, and other organizations like that. So. You can choose not to believe me. That's ultimately your choice, and I respect that. But I'll say at least for me, I have not seen that happen as often as in your situations, and we've each had our different experiences.
Yep.
All right, let's take some time to at least demo things in terms of a coding standard. And again, this is going to be talking about what should we do in terms of defining a standard. So I'm going to share case one that I advocate for a number of organizations. Let's see, let's zoom in. To get people started. And this is again focusing on the idea 6 principles or less to get code established in a form or in a standard. All right. So let's at least take that for sake of example today. So some things that I advocate for as far as rules for formatting. This is where I have started a standard for our example. SQL keywords, all caps. All right. Each environment is going to have keywords that are specific to the language. You can't use them for other things. Why advocate for this? Well, let's take a look at our example here. Our example here is a really long, wide query, and obviously this is a simplified use case. Not everybody writes their code in a single line. Humor me on that. All right. So something like that, if we can at least get all of our lines capitalized, even in a situation like that, now I quickly see what are the specific sections of my code. You know, select has to come before from, has to come before where, has to come before group by. If I get those in all caps and nothing else is in all caps, those words are going to stick out. All right. Something at least that's a little bit of functional benefit. I start getting structure. Then I go into a couple rounds here where I'm talking about carriage returns in various formats to separate things like clauses, column references, and predicates. That gets us to something more like this. So here, people don't like writing wide code, and again, this is an exaggerated example. I'm not saying everybody writes their code this way, but we like writing our code long, so I'm making sure that my coding standard focuses on the code being long and using indentation to help provide structure to it. And then the final thing that I advocate for is matching column formatting with table column names and aliasing your table names to use aliases in your column references. This is at least more for lineage analysis. So if you're working on a very complicated query, this makes it easier to see where did this come from source, in case people will try to alias things midway through. And aliasing your tables and using them in column references. Some people would argue it's exaggerated if all you're doing is querying a single table. I'd say yes, that's true. But I'd also say once you get to the point of adding in that second table in a join, I like at least just doing that up front because I like working under the assumption that analytical life cycle. I'm going to have an initial idea for the query. I'm going to get it to a state. I'm going to want to enhance it. I want to make sure that my aliases make it really easy for me to take that next step. And that gets you something like the queries here. All right. So something like that, 6 principles. That's all it takes. And you get from a single line of code or whatever your variation might be, and it gets to something like this. All right. Structured, and this is where everybody can agree to disagree on different approaches and what those 6 principles should be. And that's all fine. But I'd say at least keep it to those 6 basic principles. And again, even just basic 6 principles can make a big difference. So don't think that you have to completely overthink it. Let's see. All right, so catching up on the chat. Let's see. Andre, order by 6 at code is hard to maintain. Yes, that's an exaggerated one. I expect people to be like, "Why are you doing order by 6 and doing ordinal?" Yes, that's admittedly a joke. I'm not. I don't see a whole lot of situations where that comes up, but so that's more a hypothetical and an exaggeration. Follow rules. I if I could not break a bunch of NDA rules and also other risks there as far as doing that, I would love to see to see your take on that. Like genuinely I would. Like that would be um especially with and I honestly I don't know why I would oh, Lalo rules. Sorry about that. Didn't understand didn't catch that on the name. Um I would be interested to have a challenge on that, and I would say I would say do it 2 ways. One without AI and two with AI. Because I'll say at least AI, I think at least my bet would be on that. Not that I'm a betting man because it's not my cup of tea. But good call out there. All right. So revisiting the demo there, so at least we showed some things there in terms of functionality. Like I glossed over it a little bit for sake of time, but again, keeping the code long there, and especially some of the things I advocate for there in terms of predicates being split across multiple lines. That's where I think for a number of people, they like those keys or those quick keystrokes to comment and uncomment predicates. I do that a fair amount when I'm debugging code. Really helpful to have that. So it provided a functional benefit. So being able to comment and uncomment. UI that can plus minus a T-SQL code section. If you like using that, if you're working with a really long set of query strings, sometimes that's helpful. So think about that too. Um, Maybe think about that in terms of the code generated by your ID or your AI solutions. If it's going to generate it in a certain way, or if you're encouraging your AI to generate your code in a certain way, I think I think at least you should consider, do you want to make it so that anytime you might do a select top 1,000 and use that for the basis of a query? Uh, if that's the way your process works, maybe you want to incorporate that into your standards so you're not having to reformat every query that you generate. Decisions that you need to make. And of course, probably one of the more polarizing questions that would come around standards. So again, I'm not going to speak too strongly on laced one way or another. When are they needed, and should you incorporate that into your standard? The only things that I would think about is these two things. One, what do you do for situations where the things you have to do in your query don't necessarily follow the pattern, or the things that you would advocate for in terms of best practices? Do you want to put in comments to at least support that? Or if not, how are you going to provide documentation that explains not just what happened, but why you had to go that way with your code? And I think secondly, what are you going to forget? We all have limited memory in our brains, and so a lot of times we're going to be in situations where, I've had to go in and revisit a query that I wrote for somebody a year ago, and the memory isn't what it used to be sometimes. In that situation, plan for that future. I call it like tricking yourself or outsmarting yourself, where you know what you're probably going to forget the next time you look at this. And if so, I'm going to add in a comment that says, this is what you should probably remember the next time you look at it. Might help you at least identify where comments do or do not fit in your coding standard. All right, standard adoption. Maybe not necessarily going the spend approach, but let's talk quickly about some things that we should talk about when adopting a standard. So, a couple basic things I'd encourage for you if you're looking to adopt one and haven't yet. Or if you have already, maybe this might help if any issues arise there. First of all, I advocate for adopting what I call a keeper of the standard, and I more or less say that because I'm a D&D nerd and I'm a nerd in general, and I like things that sound epic. But you want that person who's going to prioritize your standard, that is going to be there advocating for it, is going to help make sure that the standard is adopted and is supported by the organization long term, focusing on the long term sustainability. You want somebody who's going to make it a priority in case certain circumstances happen in the organization and people try to deprioritize things like that. Other things, coding reviews. And obviously, coding reviews should be happening anyways, especially in today's market. If you're working on multiple dev teams, hopefully you're doing coding reviews. And if not, get those coding reviews in your practice right away, because it's a great opportunity to make sure that people who are not authors of the code are reviewing your code, and lets you check all aspects of the code for things like predicates, those other important areas of the code, making sure that that code is easily understood by other people in your organization. It's a great litmus test to make sure that your coding standard not only is actively happening, but that it is leading in people being able to better understand the code. Because in something like a code review, you should be able to quickly view the code that's there and be able to understand it beyond what the author is telling you. And then beyond that, you should be starting to think about, if you're not doing it today and you're going to do it now, somebody being a keeper of the standard means they need time to focus on your priorities. Coding reviews means that ideally your code is theoretically ready to go for production, and it's getting reviewed well before it's actually going to go to production, on the off chance that maybe somebody didn't adopt a coding standard. Maybe something else came up. They need time to work on adjusting their code for the coding standard, just as they would for other things that might come up in code reviews. Plan your work timelines so that, one, they have the time to appropriately go through due process, and secondly, project timelines as a whole need to plan for that as well. So if you're working agile, especially, put this in your definition of done. Say that your code needs to adopt the coding standard before you can consider a project completed. Why am I being so strong, at least about something like that for just things like formatting? Because we have to plan for when bad things happen, for those situations like what we talked about earlier. When people start talking about situations like, I need this now, I don't care how it's formatted, just get it out into production. This is critical. My budget doesn't have time for this. Why are you padding your project timelines? Trust me, my code is fine. All of those situations are going to come up. And maybe they don't in certain circumstances, but I'd rather at least plan for a future where these things could potentially happen, and if so, have a rock solid defense for it. Having appropriate game plans in place and still having that sales pitch in place so that people are ready to understand why this sort of stuff is important, including the people who would disagree with it for one reason or another. Have at least these things in place, and you're going to be ready to at least make sure your coding standard is not going to go from adopted to unadopted. So to finally wrap things up, what about AI? So people have been talking about it. I'll at least showcase the approach that I've used here using the elements that we have today. So I'm going to take this code, which, as any good cooking show, I've prepared earlier. And I'm going to go to at least GitHub Copilot. I'm going to paste it in here, and I'm going to explain what's in my prompt here. So this prompt is threefold. First step is saying, hey, I've got code here that is not adopted my coding standard. I want you to adhere to my coding standard. And that's all I want you to do. I don't want you to look at anything else in terms, well, I think I have some extra verbiage in there as far as making sure that it remains functional. All right. Then I give it my coding standard. So right now, I happen to format it as SQL code. And then I give it my code. This is the first screaming query that we looked at the start of today's session. Now, again, this is obviously an exaggerated case, but those six, and at least in this case, I added a seventh coding standard about indentations for subselects because this one happens to have a whole bunch of subselects, and this is where logistically this query makes no sense. But this is where at least somebody, they weren't writing nested subqueries. They were writing nested subqueries to define a singular column. So, okay, there's a whole lot of things going on here. This is obviously a lot of concerns. But think about that. That's still at least with utilizing something like AI and a fairly simply defined coding standard, AI can rewrite your code in a state that makes it at least trying to save that 2.5 hours I might have lost trying to reformat this by hand or otherwise having to purchase another tool. And I know there are other tools out there from Redgate and other solutions. I'm using this with a tool that costs $10 a month. So if they can beat that price point, I'd love to at least see some alternatives on that and see its flexibility in not only being able to adopt a coding standard, but also being able to adopt a coding standard as my organization wants to define the coding standard. Maybe some food for thought. And I'll say at least concerns about utilization of things like AI. Obviously, at least I'm giving this presentation. I've at least tested it in a number of situations. I have run into not many situations where the code that it returns is not returning the same output that the original code was given. But like any good responsible technician, it still is AI. You still have to put it through the paces to make sure it is giving you your functional solution. It's trying to make a prediction as best as it can. We can't expect it to be 100% perfect because if it's 100% perfect, it's not creative and it's not really giving us the full benefit of generative AI. So weigh your pros and cons there. All right, getting to the end of time here, so let's go ahead and wrap up. So what do we talk about today? Adopting those coding standards if you're in a situation that you're not actively doing this yet. So some of that final encouragement there. For sure, adopt those coding standards when possible. And especially for things like SQL code, get people on board for it. And if you're struggling with what should you define as those 6 basic principles, look to style guides for inspiration. But again, I'd say keep it simple because one, your developers will like a standard that's easier to adopt, and two, I think that opens up some better doors for AI to support you on adopting that standard. Convince your business to support it. Remember, this is about improving the quality of product in ways that your business may not see up front, other than seeing it in the way that your technical teams interact and engage with one another. That's something that they may not see, but they will see the difference when your team is working more interactively as a group. And finally, no matter what, avoid cursors. Okay, that's a little bit of a joke. There are certain situations where cursors are relevant. Don't get me wrong. For me personally, I'm of the mindset where if we're talking analytical queries and we're getting too deep down the cursor path, I'm like, let's revisit this and maybe see if there's a better approach for this. And at least for me, theoretical situation, I'm going to have to say, sorry, if you're really strongly advocating about cursors, I'm going to have to say, my standard doesn't really support cursors. And if you're in a different boat on that, you're allowed to disagree. If you have any questions and concerns about that, take it up with my keeper of the standard, and he's not someone who's easy to negotiate with. Okay, that's a joke too. All right. That brings us to the end of today's story. All right. So with that, at least, again, thanks to SQL Friday for inviting me and for having me speak today. Hopefully, at least gives you some things to think about. Maybe gives you a little bit of encouragement on things that you uh, may look to want to do, or if you're already doing it and this is just a refresher, great. Keep going over it and keep advocating for it in the community. If you want to connect with me on social media, LinkedIn's probably the best way to do it. I'll also encourage you to take a look at my YouTube channel. That's where I am continuing to make content that is both educational in the data industry and also fun. I want to make things fun. If you want the fun stuff, I released a cover of a musical song about AI earlier this year, and I also did a comedy sketch a couple weeks ago. Check that out if you're looking for something that's intended to be a little more humor to keep things fun. But with that, I have nothing else to open it up for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Jared. And if you missed parts of this presentation, it's going to be. I mean, I see we have some viewers already live on YouTube for it. If you missed parts of it, then go to Transmokopter, Transmokopter on YouTube, and then you'll find the live stream saved there. I enjoyed it. Thank you. If I can add a comment, if I'm working in an organization where everyone has read Gate SQL prompt, that beats everything I have worked with. But if it's a large organization, that's going to be a lot of money to give everybody the license for it. So then, yes, probably GitHub Copilot is going to be a less expensive way to achieve good results. But and I saw someone write in the chat, why not format the code on like as a commit hook of some sort? And yeah, why not? Use whatever tools you have basically, and try to make it look easier. I mean, if it looks prettier, it's going to be easier to understand and read. And I think it's the topic is not enough prioritized in many places. I mean, if it works, that's many teams' definition of done. But then can you open it and understand why and what you did a year down the line? That's another question. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say at least this was one of the more interesting presentations for me to ideate on this, because this is something that like I said, it may just be my own personal experience, but at least for me, I've seen some rather stark differences between not just the code itself in organizations that do or do not adopt coding standards, but more importantly, how the groups themselves interact with one another. Something like this, and I think that's what a lot of people are touching on in chat, is something like adopting a coding standard. It's not just that it's about quality of product, it's not just about technology. Because you can easily make all this code functional. You can make it so that people can write this code, and it's not theoretically impossible for organizations to be successful when their code, is written differently developer by developer. There are ways that you can make it work. I just think admittedly it's a risky space, and that's because it then puts a lot more of the focus on